Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio was the dark spin on the original we didn't know we needed. It looks like the director was inspired by the original Disney adaptations. He focused on how they recreated the terrifying visuals of Carlo Collodi's 1883 novel, but he added his spin to it. In this video, we'll discuss why Del Toro needed the Pinocchio ending to change, and a theory that shows Pinocchio's creepy connections with his other movies. First off, what Guillermo del Toro thought of the Disney adaptation. Even though it was only Disney's second full-length movie, the one from the 1940s is probably darker than most adults remember. And more than once, it comes close to the scary images of Carlo Collodi's novel, The Adventures of Pinocchio. But Del Toro remembers it all. When I was very young, I saw Disney's Pinocchio. All of a sudden, he shared, I thought this movie got how scary my childhood was. Some did, but even back then, Del Toro may have known that he didn't share the same values as Pinocchio in the Disney movies and in Collodi's original books. Pinocchio's wooden marionette comes to life in those stories when a kind of fairy blows on him. He's also told by Jiminy Cricket and his father, Geppetto, to follow his conscience. This is all part of his plan to show that he's good enough to become real. Ultimately, he's rewarded for being the way his father Geppetto wants him to be, by being turned into a real living child. But this ending wasn't satisfying enough for the director, who claimed that he celebrated disobedience as a virtue and believed in the importance of not changing to be loved. He saw a different lesson in Pinocchio. Up next, how was Del Toro's Pinocchio different? Those who've already watched Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio on a streaming service were surprised by the ending, which was a breath of fresh air. In the new movie, the character with a fatal flaw isn't the wooden boy who likes to make things look better than they are. Instead, it's his badly hurt father, Geppetto. Geppetto isn't just a nice toy maker. He's also a long-suffering father who carved Pinocchio out of wood while drunk and crazy. Geppetto's son, Carlo, had been dead for many years at this point, but he still couldn't stop going to his grave or destroying the tree next to it to make a scary wooden copy of the dead boy. Geppetto can't help but see Carlo, the lost boy, in Pinocchio's wooden face when he comes to life as Pinocchio. This makes Geppetto always compare Pinocchio to a real boy. So the ending's a relief, because Geppetto accepts Pinocchio for who he is, just as Pinocchio has to accept that his father will die. Followed by, what's the real lesson of Del Toro's Pinocchio? In the interview, Del Toro shared that the movie wasn't about Pinocchio learning to be a real boy, but about Geppetto learning to be a true father. The director also talked about how early in the process, he realized he didn't want Pinocchio to be turned into a real boy. He said it was when he first looked at Gris Grimley's design book from 2002, which was based on the story of Pinocchio. In the drawing, Pinocchio's staring at a reflection of himself, and Carlos inside the mirror. For Del Toro, this meant that Pinocchio had to stay the same physically, and it was actually Geppetto who had to learn to accept him as he was. This is what the director meant by disobedience as a test of love. Part of being a father, or any parent, is preparing a child for the fact that life ends. Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio has a similar feeling of coming to terms with death. The story goes on for years after Geppetto and Pinocchio make up and ends with Pinocchio standing by a grave where he buried Geppetto. Moving on to how the movie explores the ephemeral nature of life. It was more than just a movie, though. Del Toro also wanted us to look at the shortness of a person's life through this movie. Since he can be reborn again, it takes Pinocchio some time to understand that Geppetto will die someday, and he should focus on spending time with his father instead of going away to earn money. Del Toro explained that as old age approached, he realized there was something peaceful about accepting that life just happens, and that our time on Earth is everything. That's the lesson he tries to share throughout the movie when Pinocchio finally realizes that he might lose his father forever. The point of view challenges anyone who thinks they know the story of Pinocchio. It also gives the people watching the movie a more complex moral lesson than they might expect. Del Toro reminds us, though, that his version was never meant to be a children's movie, because it might come from an old childhood tale, but it's much deeper than that. He wanted to make sure parents knew that their children would be forced to confront their own mortality reality through this movie. Del Toro sees the movie as a piece with a few of his other important works, like The Devil's Backbone and Pan's Labyrinth. The director also said that each movie's part of a larger story being told through interconnected films. Coming up, Guillermo del Toro's movie is dedicated to his parents. Pinocchio's dedication to Guillermo del Toro's mother and father shows that the movie's about being a parent. Geppetto meets Pinocchio years after he loses his son Carlo, but he doesn't immediately let him into his life. During the movie, he grows to like and care for Pinocchio. It's a common sign of character, since everyone makes mistakes and no one's perfect. But family is still family. It's best summed up by Sebastian J. Cricket when he says that he wrote about imperfect sons and imperfect fathers. People talk about how they should do their best because that's all anyone can ask. Geppetto wants Pinocchio to behave like Carlo at first, but Pinocchio isn't Carlo. When Geppetto realizes this, he accepts Pinocchio for who he is and shows him the same kind of love that Pinocchio showed him. It's a loving relationship between a son who isn't perfect and a father who isn't perfect. Guillermo del Toro's movie makes us think about our own families right up until the bittersweet ending, which shows that people should love their families even though they aren't perfect. Next, Del Toro's Pinocchio's much darker than Disney. Del Toro's Pinocchio is much darker than Disney's because it's based on real life. For example, it talks about youth camps where kids go to be brainwashed and taught how to use weapons. The movie takes place between World War I and World War II, and the fact that Benito Mussolini's in it makes the story much darker. There's hope and humor in the story, but it also has more violent elements and scenes than Disney's version, which has some dark parts, but is much lighter than Del Toro's Pinocchio. But the movie isn't just different from Disney's version of Pinocchio because it's dark. Del Toro's version combines fantasy and reality to show how fathers and sons are related. It also shows how harmful it can be for fathers to have high expectations for their sons. Now let's take a look at a theory that shows a creepy Pinocchio connection to other Del Toro movies. Guillermo del Toro isn't known for making the funniest movies, but his strange film experiments have a lot more in common than we thought. Even though Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio has already been called Disney's darkest movie, Reddit found a scary link between Pinocchio and the rest of the director's work. The Sphinx and the Sprite are two of the new creatures that appear in Pinocchio. One Reddit theory says that they might relate to Del Toro's Pale Man, Fawn from Pan's Labyrinth, and the Angel of Death from Hellboy 2. The theory says that all these things are the same creatures from other dimensions. It all adds up if you think about it. The Pale Man, the Angel of Death, the Fairy, and the Sphinx all have eyes in strange places, mostly on their wings, and they all live in a place that looks like the underworld. And there's a different theory that claims Ophelia from Pan's Labyrinth is the Angel of Death from Hellboy 2 after she sacrificed herself, then took on some of the traits of the Pale Man and the Fawn, who can also be seen in the background of Pinocchio. Not to mention how Del Toro explores childhood and innocence in his other movies, especially with Pan. It's hard to ignore the similarities. The story of that 2006 movie took place during the Spanish Civil War, when a growing fascist state crushed a little girl's gothic fairy tale childhood. In the same way, Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio moves Collodi's fairy tale from the 1800s to Italy in the 1930s, during the rise of Benito Mussolini. It looks like there's a pattern, since he keeps returning to the contrast between a child's innocence and the cold emptiness of fascism. Intriguingly, the director hints that it has much to do with being raised by adults as it does with any historical event. For the director, it was more about how we raise kids in a totalitarian way, whether in our homes or the way society's set up. Candlewick's unhappiness and anger seem to come mainly from how his father treats him. Del Toro insisted that children's perspectives is essential since they can show us what's really important, and that children should be heard rather than forcefully taught the way adults live. Finally, the strong childhood spirit in his movies. The girl in Pan's Labyrinth is strong In the same way that Pinocchio was strong, she's tested over and over again by terrifying things, but she always keeps her spirit. The director says that his life has taught him about these ironies. It has a lot to do with what he learned from his father as a child and the mistakes he unintentionally made when he became a father himself, even though he tried to avoid repeating his father's mistakes. Still, Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio, like Pan's Labyrinth and The Devil's Backbone before it, asks parents to see the difference between top-down authoritarian parenting, like El Duce, and the kind that lets a child be who they are, even if that's a wooden boy who'll always resist the strings you tie on him. And on that note, that's a wrap for this video. What do you think of the way that Del Toro changed the ending of Pinocchio? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. See you in the next one.